Do you know what's chilling? As you're watching this video right now, Chris Watts is sitting in a Wisconsin prison, and he has just received a message. Not from his relatives. Not from a reporter. Not even from a random true crime-obsessed stranger online. This message came from one of the most feared prison organizations in the United States, the Aryan Brotherhood. On December 15th, a male officer at the Dodge Correctional Institution was performing a routine inspection, sorting through letters and envelopes like any other day. Then something caught his attention. One envelope was addressed to inmate number 17B529, Chris Watts. But there was a problem. The return address didn't exist, at least not officially. What stood out instead was a symbol marked in the corner of the envelope, a three-leaf shamrock. A symbol widely recognized across the U.S. prison system. The calling card of the Aryan Brotherhood. And when they reach out, it's never by accident. They always want something. And what they want from Chris Watts is the disturbing part. Before we get into the contents of that letter, there's something important you need to understand. This is a story the media barely touched on. After his 2018 conviction for murdering his family, Chris Watts didn't just become another inmate, he transformed into someone of interest inside the prison system. Powerful criminal groups took notice of him. What I'm about to explain changes everything you think you know about what happened after his arrest. To understand where this story is heading, we need to go back to the very beginning, to August 2018, when Chris Watts first entered prison. Because there's a secret that has remained buried for more than 6 years. It starts with his first 3 days behind bars. Before we continue, let's take a moment to remember Shannon Watts, her 2 daughters, and her unborn child. May their souls rest in peace. If you'd like, type Amen in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. August 21st, 3:47 a.m. While most of the world slept, a transport van quietly arrived at a secure holding area. Inside was Chris Watts. Why bring him in during the middle of the night instead of the daytime? For protection. When someone like Chris Watts enters prison, everyone already knows his name and what he did. In prison culture, crimes against women and children place an inmate at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Lower than the lowest. That's why inmates like Chris are often transferred at night, when most prisoners are locked down. Even then, safe is a relative term. Processing takes hours, photographs, fingerprints, psychological evaluations, background checks, questions about gang affiliations, enemies, and potential threats. And then comes the most critical decision of all, where to house him. Most inmates are placed in general population. They eat together, work together, and move relatively freely. Chris Watts was never an option for general population. Why? Because within 6 hours of arriving at the facility, Chris received his first threat. Actually, not his first. His first 47. 47 separate threats in less than 6 hours. Let that sink in. Some messages were passed through other inmates. Some came from guards who looked the other way. Others were shouted down corridors in the dark. Every message carried the same meaning. If Chris Watts ever became vulnerable, he wouldn't last a day. But one threat stood apart. At around 2 a.m., while Chris was alone in temporary detention, he heard a faint sound, the scrape of paper sliding under his cell door. He picked it up. Only 3 words were written. We know everything. What truly froze his blood wasn't the message itself, but the symbol at the bottom of the page. A shamrock. 3 leaves. To the uninitiated, it might seem harmless. But inside prison walls, that symbol sends a very clear message. It means the Aryan Brotherhood. They don't reach out unless they have a reason. Which means that from his very first day, within just 6 hours, the Brotherhood was watching Chris Watts. The question is why? What do they want from him? To find the answer, we need to look at where Chris was sent, how he was protected, and what his life inside prison has really been like over the past 6 years. And that's where this story truly begins. He didn't spend his time in a cell drowning in self-pity. Instead, he learned. He studied. And over time, he evolved into something no one expected. That transformation is exactly what drew their attention. Let me ask you something. What do you think protective custody really means? Most people hear that phrase and assume it equals safety. And technically, it does. Chris Watts is protected from other inmates who would otherwise try to harm him. But the real meaning of protective custody is this: 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Let me say that again. 23 hours. Every single day. Solitary confinement is brutally small, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, about 2.4 by 3 meters. That's smaller than most people's bathrooms. Inside that space, there's a bed, a toilet, and a sink. Nothing more. He's allowed 1 hour of recreation per day, and even that, he spends alone. No conversations. No basketball. No weights. No shared activities. He walks by himself in a confined outdoor area, constantly monitored, before being returned to the cell. Day after day. For the rest of his life. Imagine being locked inside a space the size of a parking spot for 23 hours a day. No stimulation. No human interaction. Just your thoughts. For most people, that's unbearable. Psychologically, prolonged isolation is one of the harshest punishments a human mind can endure. Studies show that long-term solitary confinement can lead to severe depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and a complete loss of reality. But Chris Watts adapted. And that's where this story takes a disturbing turn. In June 2019, less than a year after entering prison, a counselor filed a report on Chris Watts. It wasn't routine. It was flagged as abnormal. Why? Because Chris requested a law book. That alone isn't unusual. Many inmates read and study to pass the time. But Chris didn't ask for just any book. He requested specific materials: criminal law, constitutional law, prison regulations, and the justice system itself. And he didn't skim them. He studied. He took notes. He analyzed procedures. Within 8 months, Chris Watts assembled a small group and filed 14 formal complaints against the prison system. He argued that his classification, treatment, and living conditions violated his rights. He used precise legal language to support his claims. 13 of those complaints were rejected. Prison officials and the courts found no merit in them. But one succeeded. It wasn't a major victory, but it mattered. His treatment was slightly adjusted. And more importantly, it proved something crucial. Chris Watts wasn't just enduring solitary confinement, he was learning how to navigate the system. He identified weaknesses in legal procedures and knew how to exploit them. And in prison, that skill has value. Prison has its own economy, but it's not based on money alone. Currency exists in different forms: information, protection, influence. Some inmates control drugs. That's power. Some have connections outside the walls. That's leverage. Some rely on violence. That's fear. But there's another form of currency most people overlook: legal knowledge. Thousands of inmates want better conditions, fair treatment, or justice, but they don't know how to fight for it. They don't understand the system. They can't write effective motions or identify procedural errors. They need someone who can. And Chris Watts became that person. By 2020, he was doing things that caught the attention of prison staff. He helped other inmates draft legal filings. He reviewed case files. He spotted mistakes. He found loopholes. And he was good at it, very good. His involvement didn't overturn countless convictions, but it was enough to reduce sentences or improve conditions in several cases. Enough to make people notice. Other inmates wanted better housing, better food, more recreation time, and Chris Watts knew how to help them try. Which brings us back to December 15th. Back to where this story began. A letter. As usual, a supervising officer was conducting routine mail inspections. Every piece of incoming correspondence is checked. And that's when something unusual appeared. All incoming mail is screened for prohibited content, especially gang-related communication that violates prison regulations. This letter was flagged immediately. Why? Because of the shamrock symbol printed in the ink. The supervisor didn't even open the envelope. Not for a second. Instead, he took it straight to the warden's office. That's protocol. Any suspected gang correspondence is escalated immediately. I can't show you what was inside that letter. It's tied to an ongoing investigation, and prison operations aren't public. I can't reveal the exact wording. What I can tell you is this: no one expected what it contained. The letter wasn't a threat. There was no violence. No intimidation. It was an offer. Protection. Not the kind Chris Watts had been living under, but complete protection. Not only inside his current facility, but in any prison he might be transferred to. No more protective custody. No more 23-hour lockdowns in a concrete box. He would be allowed to live among the general population. Better housing. Better meals. More phone calls. More visits. Everything most inmates spend years trying to earn. But nothing comes free in prison. The Aryan Brotherhood's offer came with a condition. They formally designated Chris Watts as a legal advisor. They wanted him to review cases for their members. Draft legal strategies. Identify weaknesses in convictions. Prepare appeals. File motions. Find ways to reduce sentences and improve conditions, from inside the system. In short, they wanted him to become their lawyer behind bars. And that's what made this offer so dangerous. If Chris accepted, he would gain mobility and protection, but he would also inherit the Brotherhood's enemies. And they have many. The Mexican Mafia. The Black Guerrilla Family. Other powerful prison organizations constantly battling for control. Helping the Brotherhood paints a target on your back. Once Chris began working for them, his life expectancy would drop dramatically. It might take weeks. It might take months. But retaliation would be inevitable. Refusing, however, wasn't safe either. The Brotherhood doesn't operate like that. When they make an offer, a rejection isn't taken personally, but it is remembered. In prison politics, someone who refuses to help typically faces one of two outcomes: severe injury or worse. There is no neutral ground. The moment that letter was written, Chris Watts stopped being just another inmate with legal knowledge. He became a piece on the board, and he had to choose a side. But the situation was even more complicated than it appeared. Because the Brotherhood wasn't the only one watching him. Chris Watts had also been approached by outside law firms, legitimate ones. Firms that specialize in identifying procedural errors, wrongful convictions, and sentencing issues. They wanted to work with him as an internal research assistant. This is real. There are prison programs that allow inmates to work legally with external organizations under supervision. It gives prisoners skills, purpose, and something beyond isolation. One of these firms contacted Chris Watts 3 times over the past year. They wanted his help reviewing case files, spotting legal mistakes, and uncovering overlooked details. It was legal. It was monitored. And it offered something rare, a path that didn't involve gangs. 3 days before the Brotherhood's letter arrived, Chris told one of these attorneys that he was seriously considering accepting the offer. 3 days. Which means the timing wasn't accidental. They knew. They always know. Someone inside the prison, or connected to it, made sure the message reached the right ears. Chris Watts was trying to build a future that didn't involve prison politics. And the Brotherhood couldn't allow that. So they sent a letter with a single unspoken question. Are you with us, or against us? Now Chris faces an impossible choice. Does he accept the Brotherhood's protection and become tied to one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country for the rest of his life? Does he refuse, and hope he survives the consequences long enough for another opportunity to save him? Or does he choose a third option, one almost no one talks about, and possibly the most dangerous of all? Because Chris Watts isn't just navigating prison gangs or legal work anymore. There are forces at play far beyond prison walls. Federal forces. And by January 2024, 10 months later, everything changes. Before the Brotherhood ever sent that letter to Chris Watts, the FBI had already taken action. A specialized task force focused on domestic terrorism had been deployed, and a quiet operation was underway. You might be wondering, what does domestic terrorism have to do with prison gangs? The answer is, more than most people realize. Groups like the Aryan Brotherhood are no longer confined to prison walls. They've evolved into complex criminal networks with reach far beyond incarceration. These organizations are linked to organized crime, drug trafficking, and acts of violence carried out on the outside. In recent years, federal agencies have grown increasingly concerned about how these groups recruit, spread ideology, and coordinate activities between prisons and the streets. The question isn't just what they do behind bars, but how prison operations feed crimes beyond them. The FBI wanted answers. And to get them, they needed information. Real insight from someone on the inside, someone who had lived among these networks long enough to understand how they function. Over 6 years in prison, Chris Watts had seen it all. He'd received threats, observed gang behavior, overheard conversations, and quietly documented details about the structure and inner workings of multiple prison organizations. Originally, those notes were written for self-preservation. He wanted a record, proof that he had been threatened, that danger existed, and that prison officials were aware of it. But to the FBI, those notes represented something else entirely. Intelligence. And not just on the Aryan Brotherhood. His observations extended to other major prison groups as well. Investigators believed the information could help dismantle multiple interconnected networks. Then, in March 2024, everything changed. Without warning, Chris Watts was removed from his cell. No explanation. No notice. He was taken to the administrative wing of the facility. 2 people were waiting for him, people he had never seen before. They weren't corrections officers. They were FBI agents, dressed in suits, badges visible. And they had an offer to make.